Paul, Jan, Tamara, thanks to Judy for being here, and thanks to the friends of the Livermore Public Library for making this possible. Thanks to all of you for coming out. I have to say, you know, as a writer, you end up speaking, if you're lucky, and I have been lucky, you end up speaking at bookstores, book festivals, and at public libraries, and of all the different places that I personally speak, it's the public libraries that mean the most to me by far. And I will just tell you, I promise I'm not going to spend my whole time just kind of like bowing down in obeisance to our venue here, but I was a public library kid, the Troy Public Library in Troy, Michigan, in the Metro Detroit suburbs. And when I think of my childhood, I think other people have like memories of baseball games or like playing outdoors. Theoretically, I know this is true. All of my memories are being in a space like this, you know, sort of migrating from the very shortest shelves to the slightly taller shelves, and then finally like making my way into the adult fiction section to like begin investigating the fantasy novels. And it's not a stretch to say that the public library made me, and by extension everything that I produced, including these books. So there's a kind of circular effect here, and it always seems really meaningful and special to be able to come back and kind of pay back in a small way into that system, so the great wheel kind of keeps spinning. So let's hear it for public libraries. So here's my plan for what I want to do and how I want to spend our time together today. I'm going to talk about the book a little bit. I'm just going to say a few things that I hope will be interesting, certainly to folks who have read the book and even to people who haven't, who are planning on starting it. I'm going to leave plenty of time though for questions, and I just want to remind you that those can be totally wide-ranging. If there's something about the book that was confusing, if there's something interesting and you'd like to kind of know a little more context. I also welcome provocations, you know, if there's things, truly, if there's something about the book that annoyed you and you'd like answers, that's fun too, especially in kind of a friendly crowd like this. So please, as I speak, you know, generate some questions in your mind, because there's always that moment at the end of my presentation when I say, and are there any questions? And if it's, you know, just sort of silence, then I will contract into a point and disappear in a soft pop, and nobody wants that. Then also, I will just say also that I'm going to leave plenty of time to sign books as well, and as sort of a special enticement, I'm such a nerd. I discovered, you kind of discover how these systems work as you publish books and travel around, and I discovered, of course, that you sign books face-to-face with people when they come out to events like this, but often, especially at bookstores, you also just sign stock, store stock, which is great, because they, of course, can sell that and put a sticker on the front that says, it's a signed book. But from the beginning, something sort of didn't sit right with me about that. I always felt like there should be something special about sharing time and space with each other, and like the signature is kind of it's what seals that. It's kind of the notarization that like this happened. We breathed the same air for a moment. Of course, I didn't want to decline to sign books for bookstores or book festivals, so instead, I decided to add something to signatures that I do in person. So I had this stamp commissioned from a custom stamp making place in Michigan, and it's a GPS coordinate stamp. So whenever I go somewhere like this, I can dial in the specific GPS coordinates of our location. And I have this beautiful teal ink, and this service is only available to people who come out in person. So if I sign your book and then I, you know, sort of wave this strange contraption about it, please know that I'm indicating for posterity where in the world we actually met. So that's fun. Okay. This is just, you guys don't even know what you're in for. Alright, so I'm going to start. Basically, I want to do two things. I want to talk a little bit about the book's origin, just because I know that's something that people are often interested in. It's often a question that gets asked if I don't cover it. And then I want to just kind of dive into two particular parts of the book that mean a lot to me and have some extra resonance, and hopefully it'll be interesting to you as well. So let me start with the question, and it's always a good question, no matter how many times you ask it and how many different answers you hear. The question is, where do books come from? Where do novels come from, right? What are these sparks that sort of set the whole machinery spinning? And in this book's case, I knew, basically I finished my first novel, I decided I wanted to try to write another one. I emptied out the entire contents of my brain into that first novel. There was nothing left, and I had to start from scratch. And I was kind of I definitely was in the world and living day-to-day life and experiencing things and having conversations with my antenna extended. I was like listening for these different vibrations and just waiting for something that resonated, that made me kind of vibrate with curiosity. And I found that thing. And that thing was actually something that's not in the book. It was, is anyone in this room, I'm actually curious, given where we are, I suspect maybe at least a handful of people know this term. It's a beautiful term, totally evocative, and the term is suitcase clone. Has anybody heard that combination of words? Okay, I'm surprised to hear that, given that we're in the Bay Area and in Livermore in particular. I will tell you, I learned it, I think, in just some nerdy book about kind of food history, or maybe it was like Bay Area food stuff. A suitcase clone was a particular kind of vine, essentially. And what would happen is that, especially in the early days of California winemaking, when all these winemakers are kind of, they're like, we're going to really do this. We're going to do this for real. We're going to be taken seriously, and we're going to start to make wines that are the equal of the great wines of the old world, of Europe, of France, and Italy. One of the things they would do is they would find a plot of land. Let's say it's you. Let's say one of you decided, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make great wine, and like the year is 1970. And you found some land in Napa, because you can probably still get a little bit of land in Napa in 1970. And there's nothing there. And rather than just plant vines straight away, you call me. You're like good for nothing, confidant friend. You're like, I have a mission for you. How would you like to take an all expenses paid trip to Burgundy? I'm like, yes, I will do that for you, sure. And you say, great, here's what you're gonna do. Here's your plane ticket, here's where you're gonna stay, key to this B&B, it's beautiful, enjoy yourself, spend a whole week. Walk around, enjoy the weather, enjoy the scenery, drink lots of good wine. Oh, and on the last day you're there, if you could just take a stroll past one of those vineyards, one of those ancient vineyards that's been planted there for 1,000 years and been producing wonderful wine the whole time. And as you're walking, if you could maybe realize that your shoe is untied, and bend down and produce the pocket knife that you've kept in your front pocket, and just snick, take a few cuttings. And then, with those cuttings, sort of, maybe you stuff them down your pant leg, make haste back to the B&B, wet some towels under the faucet, wrap them well, put them at the bottom of your luggage, underneath everything else, pile your underwear and everything on top of that, book it back to California. Do not declare that at customs. Instead, bring it back to me in Napa, where I will take those shoots, I will graft them onto American rootstock, and I will cut and graft, and over the space of a few more years, I will have propagated them throughout the entire vineyard, and so I too will have these wonderful grapes. I will have the grapes Burgundy. And this kind of vine, or this kind of procedure, became known as the suitcase clone. So it's a cool story. It's fun. And to me, that vibe was irresistible. The truth is, if I'm honest, I don't care that much about wine. I like it as much as the next person, but I'm not like deeply into the world of wine. But that picture, the sort of combination of a spy story, that sort of sneaky stuff and people smuggling things across borders, along with the really comfortable, familiar, warm feeling of like food, California food, just seemed like a great combination to me. So that was my spark, but here's where things get interesting. And I'm gonna go kind of nerdy here and actually a little bit technical in writing terms, which I'm sometimes hesitant to do, but you all came out to sit in a shadowed room in the library on a sunny Saturday, so you chose this. I started writing that story, and these chapters exist. There's text that I wrote, and it kind of began as the sun rose over these, vineyards up in, Sonoma, or like up in Anderson Valley, a place that I really love. So it's going to be great. There's going to be this vine. It's going to be kind of spooky, and it's going to maybe have some strange properties that we'll have to figure out over time. It'll have this whole backstory, blah, 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 blah. I couldn't make it work. And not for lack of trying. I tried and tried and tried, but just something about it, the story, again, if you think of the spark as something that's going to maybe kick off that piston action of the story, this story was not turning over. It was like an engine just going, brr, 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 brr. And finally, I realized what it was. I was actually able to diagnose my own problem. The problem was that the clock of the story was too slow. If you think about it, in winemaking, there's this natural cadence, and that's true of a lot of agricultural endeavors, but certainly winemaking. It's got this annual rhythm, right? You know, the vines grow, they produce fruit once a year, it's harvested, and if the central mystery of my story was going to be about the character and the property of these vines, it was going to have to happen like once a year. And so I was looking at this story, this novel that like unfolded over a decade, some like slow, seasonal, even generational tale. And it just wasn't kind of the kind of book I wanted to write, and it wasn't the kind of book that I thought I was any good at writing. I definitely had never written anything that was quite that slow and languorous. So this was quite challenging to me, quite frustrating. And I really felt stuck, and I felt as if I would maybe have to abandon that idea, abandon that whole vibe, that world of kind of, you know, sneaky spy stuff and food combined, until I looked around my own kitchen and saw in the corner my sourdough starter. And I realized that here I had like literally the answer to this puzzle, a thing that would kind of make the equation balance. Because here we have a substance that could be smuggled, and indeed sourdough starters have been, you know, taken across borders. They've circled the world, sometimes in secret, sometimes not, for as long as there have been sourdough starters. It could have strange properties, in fact, even stranger properties than a mere grape. And the tempo of baking sourdough bread is daily. The pistons of the story, instead of going like, kaboom, seasons pass, kaboom, it could go, chunk, 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 chunk. And my protagonist, my baker, could be learning new things and sort of diving deeper into this mystery day by day by day, which of course is exactly what happened in the book that became Sourdough. So that's where it started. I solved my puzzle, and truly, sometimes you know when you found the answer because suddenly things become easy. They really did. With that, I was writing, I was off to the races, time passed, I finished this novel, and I ended up with this book, Sourdough. So now, the Sourdough came out, the first edition, the hardcover edition came out in 2017, the paperback edition followed a year after, international editions kind of appeared sporadically in the time since. And so now, of course, I have the benefit of hindsight, and so I'm able to contemplate not just this book's beginning, or even my intentions for it, but also kind of what I think of it. You know, I'm able, not 100%, but at least a little bit, to regard it as a reader myself, which is exciting. And as I have done that, I have identified two parts of the book that really mean the most to me. And on the day the book was released, I don't know if I would have been able to say these were the two parts of the book, kind of the two lobes of its brain, or maybe the two chambers of its heart. But with time, they're the parts that I have found myself returning to most often. I really do think they're kind of these souls, the two souls of the book. So I want to share them with you now and just explain a little more about why they're so important to me. And I'm also just curious to know, maybe you can tell me, you know, over a book if I cite it, or just raise your hand and tell me later. I'm actually curious to know if these are surprising choices to you, or if you're like, yeah, no kidding, that's what people's about you. And it could really go either way. So, soul number one. To understand this and maybe put it into context, it's important for you to know that in the time since publishing this book, I almost feel like I'm a parody of myself. In the time since publishing this book, I have started a small food business. I actually run a very small olive oil producer with my partner, Catherine Tomajan. It's very local, actually. We lease a 3-acre grove, 327 trees in Sonol, so just down the road. We drive there from where we live in Oakland. It's called Fat Gold, is the name of the olive oil producer. And I always say that Robin Sloan completists really ought to subscribe to our olive oil. We offer it mostly in an annual subscription program, because every issue of the olive oil comes with the zine that I write that explains the backstory of the oil and kind of, you know, how to use it, and, you know, fun olive oil facts and all that kind of stuff. The point, though, is that work on Fat Gold and work making olive oil, and in case it's not clear, I've never done anything like this before in my life. All of my work up until that point was symbols, mostly symbols on screens. You know, this was the work of the abstract and sort of, you know, the composition and distribution of ideas. And suddenly I'm making something real. I'm making something that takes up space. It's very heavy in these big drums. And the point is for this stuff to be consumed. I mean, that's what success is. And we've done this several times, and I didn't expect it to feel as good as it does when we sell the last drop. We're like, there's none left. We sold it all. It's all going to go into people's bodies. So, with that in mind, it might make sense that this part has come to mean a lot more to me. So this is a tiny section from Lois's earliest days baking bread, when she's really getting into the rhythm of doing it. She's still working at the robot company, so she's able to kind of compare her life and her work at the robot company with this new thing she's doing, this sourdough bread baking. It was a decidedly different kind of work. At General Dexterity, I was contributing to an effort to make repetitive labor obsolete. After a trainer in the Task Acquisition Center taught an arm how to do something, all the arms did it perfectly, forever. In other words, you solved the problem once, and then you moved on to more interesting things. Baking, by contrast, was solving the same problem over and over again, because every time the solution was consumed. I mean, really, chewed and digested. Thus, the problem was ongoing. Thus, the problem was perhaps the point. So, I feel that tension. Again, I'm curious to know if it resonates as much with other people in the room, or if it resonates with you, if it resonated with you when you read the book. But boy, I feel that tension. To me, there's not actually a right answer in that kind of duality. I feel, especially now more than I did when I wrote the book, I feel strongly the tug in both directions. And I think there's actually a special connection here to the kind of life and work of a lot of people in the Bay Area. I'm sure there are people in this room who work in tech, or or you're kind of tech proximate in one way or another. And if so, you know that at the root of so many of these businesses, not all, but many, is taking something that was repetitive and maybe annoying and making it go away, making it automatic. And there's incredible power in that, of course, as well as incredible profit, that much is self-evident. But there's also some amount of loss, and I think that varies depending on what the thing is, what the repetitive, annoying thing is. But I think often, not only of things like baking or any kind of food preparation, which are indeed threatened in some cases by, pizza slinging robots or, robot baristas and things like that. But I think of jobs that actually are long gone, things we have lost already, and sort of warning signs, perhaps, of what this looks like. And again, there's never a right or wrong. It's always kind of suspended in this tension. I don't know how many of you in this room know about the old linotype machines. These were these amazing, clanking, hot machines that were used. These are not primitive machines. These are extremely, extremely high tech. They were used mostly in newspapers to set rows of type that were then laid together to compose these pages. And so in the belly of a newspaper like the New York Times or the San Francisco Chronicle, there would be, you could probably hear it from the 14th floor, but then you would descend down and you would find these operators of these machines. And at the sort of the belly of the machine, there's literally a vat of boiling lead, and it's kind of like spattering up. And so you always would know a linotype operator because their pants would have little holes from the spattered lead. So they're sitting there operating this machine, through which this incandescently hot metal is flowing to form these letters, which are going to get spit out and then laid on these pages, which are used to make impressions and print the newspaper. But keep in mind, these people are not just pushing buttons. They're also the last line of defense for typos, for incorrect usage, grammar, syntax, newspaper style. The linotype operator, you can't even believe this was someone's job. They were essentially a combination copy editor, metalsmith, doing both at an extremely high level in real time. And the people who did the job really loved it. They were well paid. It was a highly, highly skilled job, part of these great unions, and the job went away. It's gone now. Of course, it's much cheaper to produce newspapers, it's much cheaper to produce printing of all kinds, but that way of using a human brain and that way of making a living, it's gone. So I think it's interesting to think about. Again, there's tension. This is not a story of, oh, we lost something and it's terrible, or we made the world a faster, more efficient place and it's great. Somehow both are true at once. So that's the first part of the soul. This is the other part. I'm just going to read the section first. This is later in the book. Some of you who have read it may remember that there's a scene where Dr. Jaina Mitra is kind of demonstrating some of her tools, and she has Horace Portasio spit into a tube, and she tells him what microbes are there in the spit. And a crowd is gathered, and Lois is there, and someone else named Kenyatta, who grows vegetables in these amazing pink light greenhouses in the Marrow Fair, is there as well. And near the end of this demonstration, they get into an argument. That's what Kenyatta says. "Seriously?" he sputtered. "You need to come here to do that?" He clutched his head and walked in a little circle. Disbelief. "I thought this place was supposed to be for new ideas, but I don't know, Dr. Mitra, this sounds like a lot of the same old GMO shit to me." "It's really not. Did you get rejected from DuPont, or what?" "No? Well, maybe you should take this there. They'd be all over it." "You have a problem with Lembus," Jaina Mitra said, "but I'm not sure what it is. This approach, everything you're doing, the scanning, the editing, it's the height of hubris, like the height. Look around. I'm sorry if this sounds mean, but we don't need you to work on this. The plants are way, way ahead of you, Dr. Mitra. Do you really think," she interrupts, "Mr. Marrow supports my project?" Kenyatta snorted. "I wonder what he'd say if I told him it was either your lab or our grow rooms. We make half of the food that goes out the door here." He started to stomp away, then caught himself and turned back. He made a final plea. "Listen, I'm no traditionalist. I mean, pink LEDs, come on. But there's a difference, right? Plants have developed over millions of years. They just work. What you're doing, it's not natural." Jaina Mitra clicked her tongue. "Nothing is natural." After the sequencing session was over, I walked with Horace to the grove at the heart of the concourse. "These are Meyer lemons," Horace said as we passed the trees. "They're named for Frank Nicholas Meyer. He was Dutch by birth, but he was an agent of the United States government. He worked for the Department of Agriculture's Office of Seed and Plant Introduction before the First World War. I thought of him when Jaina Mitra spoke of her microbial survey. Meyer and his cohort were hunters for larger prey. They canvassed the world and sent back living samples of plants thought to be useful to the advancement of the American economy. Meyer worked in China. He sent the first soybean to America, and persimmons. Any persimmon grown in this country today comes from that lineage. And, of course, there are these lemons, named for him. Meyer died in China. He drowned in the Yangtze, pushed from a riverboat. I looked at the trees with new appreciation. Horace said, he sent these across the Pacific, and the Spanish sent tomatoes to Italy in the 16th century, that recently, and the Portuguese, chilies to India. Maybe a comet brought it all to Earth in the first place. Who knows? Oh, I quite agree with Jaina Mitra. He plucked a lemon from a tree. Nothing is natural. So, that's just a true story about Meyer lemons. Did anyone know that already? Are there some yeah, so fascinating. And there's a story like that behind almost everything, except like acorns. You're like, acorns? Yep, they're just here. So here's why. So I think you can sense why that's part of the soul of the book. But I think it's something that's worth expanding and kind of dwelling on a little bit, especially right here in California, in the Bay Area, in Livermore, because we are really into this idea of our fresh, organic, natural produce, right? And we should be, because it's something to celebrate, and I mean, it's a wonderful thing to have access to a farmer's market full of all this stuff. But I do think we should balance that enjoyment and that appreciation with history and with context and with understanding that these things all have complicated histories. It's not some, California cornucopia, and we just stumbled in like, look, avocados and persimmons and Meyer lemons, it's so great. Like, no, not at all. All of these things arrived here, not necessarily in the state they're even in today, driven by or sort of carried by an unthinkably complicated, deep, and old web of connections. And this is everything. It's commerce, it's empire, it's conquest, curiosity, science. It is taste and cooking and culture and people who just really, really love things. But it's all of it jammed together, and things, you can imagine it almost like a wild network of tubes, like a water park times a million, and all this stuff is flowing through the tubes and getting shunted this way and that, and it comes at the end, and these different things come to land in different places. And it's something, I guess it's something natural about humans, that we're so quick to be like, so comfortable, tomatoes, just like Grandma used to use in her pasta sauce. And Italians are like, oh no, Grandma never saw a tomato. Some of it depends on your time frame, right? If for you 100 years is it, then maybe it's fair to say that like the Meyer lemon is a California thing, or that tomato sauce is an Italian thing. But it will not surprise you to hear that I do not think 100 years is enough of a lens. I think you need to go bigger to understand the world we live in. And I'll say finally, to kind of close out that part of the soul of the book, that there's a connection to where we are right now. There's a connection to the public library, an analogy, I should say. Because often, and I might be describing some of you and some of your kind of feelings toward the library here, and if so, I hope you take this to heart. The public library is in some ways a kind of secular temple. It's a secular temple to the cult of the book, especially the physical book. I, of course, am a member of this cult. I like to lead a chapter of this cult very happily and very enthusiastically. But often when people think about books, when they talk about why they love books, they come back to feelings of familiarity, feelings of comfort, a feeling that the printed book is this traditional thing. It's actually something stable and reliable in an otherwise kind of shifting world. And you can curl up with a good book. What could be more natural than that? And of course, it won't surprise you to hear that I want to remind everyone that nothing could be less natural than a book. Books, too, are relatively recent inventions. As recently as 500 years ago, a blink of an eye, books were not comfortable. They were these enormous, giant things restricted to a very small audience of priests and some rich nobility, scholars. Each one cost about as much as a car because it was made from like an entire herd of cows. And of course they were handwritten, at great expense by these scribes. And the experience of reading in like the year, let's just say, like 1450, if you're somebody who like reads a lot of books, your experience of reading is dealing with these huge, extremely expensive, extremely restrictive objects on a big lectern, actually a lot like this, and you're turning the pages over. Of course it's dark. Of course the monk next to you has cholera. He's like coughing in the book. You're turning the pages. Oh, the magic of reading. That didn't come until later. And that was around the end. If any of you in the room have read my first novel, Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, you have heard at least part of this story. I mean, this is what happens in Venice and other places soon after around Europe, around the year 1500. They don't quite invent these, but they get pretty close. Suddenly books get small, they get comfortable, they get accessible. And that's technology. They invented something in the same way that, a company across the way invented this and has changed the world with it. And I think we do a book, a printed book, actually a great disservice if we don't give it the same respect, the same awe that we give these. I think we ought to, even though they are more familiar now. So I invite you, next time you walk the stacks of the Livermore Public Library, kind of squint your eyes a little bit and just like see it, not as in fact, the comfortable, sort of wonderful, affirming place that it is, but as like a stockpile of high technology. Each one of these books a sort of bristling machine that, it should be said, how many phones have I gone through in the time that some of my print books have continued to fulfill their function without a hiccup, with no batteries required. They are actually, it turns out, very good machines. I mean that very seriously. Sometimes it can sound a little glib to call these books like very effective gadgets, but I mean it very seriously. I think they're serious stuff in that regard. So, in closing, food is technology, books are technology, And if you remember only one thing from this whole talk and this whole afternoon, remember that Robin says, nothing is natural. Thank you for your time. And now I would be totally happy to take some questions if you have them. And again, they can be about sourdough, they can be about books and writing in general, they can be life advice. I'm totally open to it. Yeah, right there.
You take quite an excursion in gender roles in this, and the stereotypes of tech nerds and women in a bunch of different sorts of leadership roles and other types of roles in the book. Can you talk a little bit about why you picked these characters and their genders?
Yeah, sure. So the question is, there's just kind of the I guess you could say, choice of gender for many of the different characters, not least of which is Lois, the narrator, but there's all sorts of people with interesting roles. In particular, I mean, I don't know if this is exactly what you mean, but I think of Dr. Jana Mitra, and I think of, well, actually, the last one I don't want to say because it's a spoiler, so there is another character that kind of, the gender turns out to be interesting. And that's a great question. I can't say that I actually have a great answer to it. I will say that I was a little bit nervous, as I think anybody ought to be, any reasonable writer ought to, have some kind of healthy, not reluctance, but just self-awareness about writing across sort of gender or any other kind of difference. And so I tried to do it carefully. I got readers to read all sorts of different versions of this, be like, and it's just like transparently a dude being like, so she makes some bread as a woman, and I didn't want to do that. I will just say that I'm happy with how it turned out, and I think that and others might agree or disagree that it turned out well or credibly, but I think if it did work, one of the reasons for that is that I actually just wrote it as if it was me. Turns out that people in these kind of situations, solving problems, marshaling their resources, it's pretty similar. Can be a pretty similar experience. So, what else? Yeah, in the front row right here.
Who are the Moz?
The Moz.
Moz?
Yes. So who are the Moz? Is the I guess I don't want to say too much in case people haven't read it, but there's a culture, sort of a group of people called the Moz. That's why I say it. Other interpretations are welcome. And they are an invention. I didn't want to use a real group of people from the world because I was going to ascribe some fictional, if nothing else, a fictional cuisine, and I felt like it was a bit much to kind of be like, yes, Romanian, except I've kind of jammed these other things in there. So I decided to go fully fictional. But I will say, and I think this is apparent if to a lot of people who read the book, there are some inspirations there, some cues, and those include, not limited to, but they include things like the Roma, Turkish cuisine, certainly, and also, I have some heritage that's Hungarian and Croatian, and so, I can't say that I have like a deep connection to that culture or that part of the world, but it's been part of my life. Everything from some of the flavors and like liberal application of paprika to just the way certain music sounds. And in fact, if I had to put my finger on one thing, the kernel of that group and that identity, it was actually the music. Before I ever started writing this book, I was a fan of a real kind of music called Klapa, K-L-A-P-A. It's a kind of Croatian choral singing, and some of the groups are all men, some are all women, some are mixed, but it's always a cappella choral music. It's of course in Croatian, which I don't understand, so maybe the songs are all really dorky. But to me, they sound magical, and it is like especially if you like choral music, it's well worth looking this up online. It is a truly spooky, sort of otherworldly sound. And so when I talked about the music of the Moz in the book, when I describe it, and kind of you hear Lois say that, like, for an instant it felt like she could understand the words, but then it kind of just spins away into space. I was thinking literally and specifically of this kind of music called Klapa. So I think that's the best answer to the question.
I listened to the book, so I got
yeah, the great sound. That's right. Yeah, that's the audiobook. The audiobook has some samples of this. It's actually not Klapa. It's been processed in an odd way, but I'm very, very happy with how it turned out. Yeah. So it's a little bonus for whatever.
You dedicate your book to Catherine, and I'm interested because those people usually know you the best when you dedicate to them, either because you're sorry or because you're thankful. So I'm always just curious, which is it, and who was she?
That is a great question. I love that. I'm going to repeat that part because it's worth repeating. The person to whom you dedicate the book, you're either the most sorry to or the most grateful to. No, in this case, I was not sorry. No, never sorry. I was most grateful for sure. So Catherine is my partner in life and in olive oil business. Has been for a long time. Her full name is Catherine Tomajan, and really before any of that, she was my guide to the world of food, specifically California food. I was truly, it's going to disgust some of you, but there's a section in the beginning of the book that is Lois's like autobiography of eating. She talks about her path and like eating and her struggles with it over time and kind of the things that led her to subsisting on this gross stuff called slurring. And that section of the book is pretty autobiographical, at least for me until I was probably like 25 or 26 years old. Living in San Francisco, California, I just was like, what does a person eat? How do you sustain yourself? I didn't know anything. And there were many influences, but chief among them was Catherine Tomajan, who like fed me my first bites of a lot of really good things. So it was no question that this book was going to be dedicated to her.
And how would she describe you?
How would she describe me? Oh, that's a good question.
The truth.
You know what? I'm gonna have to decline to answer only because it's. I mean, it is. If she was someone that I knew a little bit, but like, it's too much. It's one of those relationships where it's too much. What?
It's another book.
Yeah, maybe so. Who else? Yeah, maybe let me just. I'll read. Oh,
I have
we'll
a
get
million questions, but my name's Charity, and I'm
Great.
writing a book right now.
Great.
I'm almost finished with it, so I was wondering if I could email you some time and get your advice on that.
Of course, I'm always.
I'm trying to find somebody to help me out. Like I had an editor, she canceled on me, and I was just so devastated. So
I'm always happy to help support whoever I can. Yeah. Let me do this one in the front here. Yeah, in the pleasure.
So I really enjoyed the Lois Club.
Yeah.
I was wondering, I have two questions I apologize, excuse me. Is that real? And if it wasn't, how did you create it?
Yeah, that's a
The
great
second
question.
one is, have you been invited back to Chez Panisse since you're
Two good questions. Two great questions. I'll do two. The short answers to both. The first question is the Lois Club real? And the answer is, I'm so happy to be able to report to you that it is real. It is. I love, as a writer, and I don't think this is uncommon, it's really fun to find things that are right on that balance point of like, is that possibly real? And then also to invent some things that create those same questions. And so in this case, it was just on the other side of reality, and it was in fact my friend Lois, who years ago told me about this weird thing called the Lois Club, and you know that you are having a conversation with a writer when they say, hold on, I need to write that down. And it went into my notes and stayed there for years, and then finally when I don't even remember how it came into this book. I think I just was, the main character did have a different name in an early draft, and I was casting about, it didn't feel like the right name, and I think maybe I was into my notes and I found Lois and the Lois Club, and I went, oh yeah. That's definitely good. And the other question is, have I been permitted to dine at Chez Panisse since writing this book? I have not tried, but I did hear a good recognizance that one of the main chefs, I forget her name, but one of the main chefs at Chez Panisse did read the book and enjoyed it. At least that's what I heard. Maybe that got toned down. So I will say this. I think it's pretty transparent that there's I have some fun with the kind of vibe and persona, institutional persona of Chez Panisse, and of course Alice Waters in this book. I hope it's clear that it is, yes, a bit of satire, but also homage. And one of the things that I really want to bring out that I think is actually underappreciated is that that place and that whole network of people. I mean, truly the Chez Panisse mafia. Like, so I actually realized just before I started the book. I realized that we were talking about restaurants, Bay Area restaurants. And I ticked off my 3 favorite restaurants at that time, and then somebody told me, like, you realize, wow, okay, Sloan, very predictable. You realize those places were all started by Chez Panisse alumni.
Yeah.
I was like, it's the Chez Panisse world, and I just live in it. And I think that's really powerful and underappreciated. That system, that social network, is a very powerful force in Bay Area food, and I think it's worthwhile to recognize it. Yeah, right there.
How did you hook up with the Naval Air Station?
Oh, I'll tell you. So a big part of the book, of course, takes place under the air base on Alameda. Again, the really wonderful thing about being a fiction writer is that you are able, if you're attentive, you can basically metabolize anything that happens in your everyday life into some story sometime. Maybe not immediately, but it folds in. Or like a starter, it kind of just it bubbles. And I got invited to years ago, I mean more than a decade ago, I got invited to a movie night for a company that at that time leased the control tower on the air base. It was the whole redevelopment of the base in Alameda is further along now. At that time it was I think still a little more ragged, but they got their hands on the control tower, and so you kind of like, just as Lois does in the novel, you would kind of like be following your map like, am I in the right place? But they were there inside, they were, you know, watching Ghostbusters on a big projector. They had a keg of beer up in the tower itself. It was great, and I just remembered that for all the years that followed and decided that was going to be my setting for the Fair. Yeah. A couple more people have it. Yeah, back there.
I really enjoyed the cheese guy, the bacteria, and the war, and I just thought with the sort of virus coming out of China right now, there was just, you know, virus versus bacteria. I mean, where did that come from?
Right, so the question is about Gripa, the sort of microbial philosopher. It's the case that basically, I think this is true for some writers, maybe not all. It's definitely the case for me that anything anybody says in any of my books is me talking. Like, I just am not the kind of person that would ever put a line in a book, even really in the most heinous villain's mouth, that I fundamentally didn't believe it, that I thought was bullshit. And so, of course, you know, some of the things contradict, and it means that I hold contradictory ideas about things, and I'm kind of putting them in display. But that's all to say that the kind of like wild-eyed section where Agrippa, the, you know, radioactive cheesemaker, is kind of like about microbes and the cosmos and how microbes have got it all going on. That's basically just me going about microbes. And it's ridiculous. Microbes have got it going on.
Yeah.
One more if somebody else has got one.
Oh, way back there.
Yeah.
Okay, this is about Mr. Penumbra's bookstore.
Oh, great.
I came to Silicon Valley Reads years ago for to talk to Campbell. And back then, I asked you about the screenplay, because your books, when I read your books, I see characters in my head. You know, my old neighbor, or, you know, Robert De Niro, and I know, so as I'm reading, I'm picturing it, you know, you're so eloquent in your description. So back then, like, you had, I don't know if there was a screenplay that works or not, but I'm just wondering if over the years, if anything's coming out, that'd be great.
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, both books, the question is just kind of about adaptation. I will say, people sometimes ask, like, who do you see cast as, you know, Mr. Penumbra or Lois? And I always have to say, I wish I need to sit down and spend a whole day, like, looking at actors to choose someone. I wish I had a good answer. I never do, because I have no idea. And that's not how I imagine them. It is a little more abstract for me. But more broadly about adaptation, this is actually a good question to kind of close on. Both books have been optioned. Mr. Penumbra's the first one several times, in fact, which may tell you something. Of course it's exciting and it's great. I mean, and flattering when somebody says, I see the cinematic potential here, or like this would make a great Netflix show, and I'd like to, you know, try my hand at developing it. But then, as has happened through several cycles for both books actually, it just kind of peters out. A report from the front lines of sort of that industry, very interestingly to me, no one ever says it's over. Instead, because you begin at a point of extremely high enthusiasm, and you hear from them a lot. They're like, "Good news, we set the movie with Disney. It's going to be awesome." and then time passes. They're like, "Well, Disney wasn't into it yet, but in the meantime, we'll do blah 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 blah." More time passes. You hear from them less and less. But there's never, you know, it's like, no, it's not going to work. It's just like, I don't know why. They're like the silence. There's like, oh no, we don't talk about that book anymore. So the books have not been produced, and the reason is that it's just super hard to get things produced. You can imagine it's sort of like a funnel, you know. literally thousands of projects, books that get optioned, or like, you know, screenplays that are brand new and original, lots of comic books, all sorts of things. They go into the one end of the funnel, and then they get just brutally winnowed, and at every step along the way, all it takes is one person to be like, no thanks, I'm busy, Patrick Stewart is busy, like whatever. So it has made me, but the reason I think it's a nice thing to end on is it kind of actually brings us back here to the public library. Of course, I hope that both books get made into something at some point. It would be awesome to see somebody's interpretation on the screen, but it has made me even more grateful than I already was for the fact that that actually doesn't happen with books. And I think this is a good thing to know for anyone in the room who is working on a book, has ever thought about working on a book. If you write a book and you put in the work, which is not insubstantial, like if you put in the work and you sit down and you make a draft and then you redo that draft and then you redo that draft and you really put in the hours, but in the end, if you end up with something that you're proud of and that you can give to at least a few other people, you know, friends or other first readers, and they say, it's fun to read. If you do that, you can get that book published. You might not get published with Knopf, you know, it might be with a smaller press, an independent press, maybe, you know, one of these, there's a ton of them, and they're actually like really wonderful presses in Berkeley, all over the country, but you can get it published. And it can get into other people's hands, and it can be read by people. That's not the case with these adaptations. These people put in all the work. They do all it's such hard work, and they spend so much time on it, and it never sees the light of day. So I think it's a pretty magical thing about books, that like, they can make it. And in fact, at the end of the day, it really is just up to the writer sitting down, doing the work, and that's sort of a beautiful thing. I'm glad that's still possible in a world that's otherwise quite chaotic and you know, hard to predict. So with that, I will say thank you again so much. I'm going to set up over here. We have